My name is Vivian Cross, and I remember the exact sound those plates made when they shattered against my dining room floor. Not the crash, that was too quick, too merciful. It was the aftermath I'll never forget. The delicate tinkling of porcelain fragments settling into silence while 23 guests stared at me in horrified fascination. I was 64 years old, standing in my own home, wearing my grandmother's pearls and the navy dress I'd chosen specifically because it made me look dignified. Dignified. What a joke that word would become. "You useless old woman," Lauren Price, my daughter-in-law of 3 years, screamed across my dining room. "Aren't you going to serve my parents? Or are you too senile to remember how to be a proper hostess?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, watching to see how the elderly widow would respond to being publicly humiliated by a woman young enough to be her daughter. Lauren stood there in her designer dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her face flushed with wine and entitlement. She was 32 years old and beautiful in the way that opens doors and closes questions. She was also my son Michael's wife, which had protected her from my judgment for far too long. Behind her, Eleanor and Patrick Price, her wealthy, snobbish parents, smirked with barely concealed satisfaction. They'd never liked me, had always thought their precious daughter had married beneath her when she chose my son. Now, they were watching their daughter put the old woman in her place, and they were enjoying every moment of it. The guests included my neighbors, my book club friends, colleagues from Michael's law firm, and several family members who'd driven hours to spend Thanksgiving with us. All of them now had front row seats to my public destruction. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped in front of me, my pearls catching the light from the chandelier my late husband Charles had installed 30 years ago. The same chandelier that had illuminated countless family dinners, birthday celebrations, and holiday gatherings when this house had been filled with love instead of venom. "Well," Lauren demanded, kicking at the broken porcelain with her $1,000 shoes, "are you going to clean this mess up, or do I need to call someone who actually knows how to run a household?" The silence stretched like a tightrope. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, could smell the turkey that was probably overcooking in the kitchen, could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on me from every direction. My son Michael sat at the head of the table, Charles's old seat, the one I'd allowed him to take after his father died, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. My own son, watching his wife destroy his mother's dignity, and he was too weak to speak up. That's when I understood something fundamental about revenge. It begins in silence. Not in the screaming, not in the crying, not in the desperate attempts to defend yourself in the moment. It begins in the quiet space where humiliation crystallizes into something harder and more dangerous. I looked at Lauren, really looked at her. She was drunk on wine and power, reveling in her ability to reduce me to nothing in front of an audience. She thought she'd won some kind of victory, established some sort of dominance. She had no idea she'd just handed me the motivation to destroy her completely. "Of course," I said quietly, my voice steady as bedrock. "I'll take care of it." I walked to the kitchen, retrieved a dustpan and broom, and returned to kneel on my own dining room floor while my guests watched in uncomfortable silence. Lauren stood over me like a conqueror, occasionally making comments about how pathetic I looked, how embarrassing it must be to be so old and useless. With each piece of broken china I swept up, I made mental notes. Lauren's cruelty wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated, performed for an audience that included her parents and my neighbors. She wanted everyone to see that she'd reduced the dignified widow to a servant in her own home. But what Lauren didn't know, what none of them knew, was that humiliation is just another form of education. She was teaching me exactly who she was beneath the beautiful facade. She was showing me that she viewed me as disposable, as an obstacle to be removed or neutralized. She was also giving me moral permission to destroy her without mercy. As I finished cleaning her mess, I caught the eye of Judge Franklin Moore, an old family friend who'd known Charles for decades. The look of disgust on his face wasn't directed at me. It was aimed squarely at Lauren.
Good.
I'd need allies for what came next. The dinner continued in awkward fits and starts. Lauren held court like a queen, making jokes about my age and incompetence while her parents laughed and my other guests tried to pretend they weren't witnessing a family's complete dysfunction. I served the meal with the same grace I'd used for 40 years of entertaining, but something fundamental had changed. Every smile was calculated, every polite response was strategic. I was no longer playing the role of the gracious hostess. I was gathering intelligence on my enemy. Lauren worked as a senior financial executive at Davidson and Associates, one of the city's most prestigious investment firms. She managed portfolios worth millions of dollars and had been featured in the business section of the newspaper as a rising star in finance. She drove a BMW, lived in a house that cost more than most people made in a decade, and wore jewelry that could fund a small business. All of this on a salary that, according to Michael, was substantial but not quite substantial enough to support her lifestyle. Interesting. After the last guest left and Michael retreated to his study with a bottle of scotch, his usual response to family tension, Lauren cornered me in the kitchen. "I hope you learned your lesson tonight," she said, her voice still carrying that edge of cruelty that wine had sharpened. "This is my family now, and I won't tolerate being embarrassed by your incompetence." I looked at her for a long moment, memorizing every detail of her face, every inflection in her voice. "Of course, dear. I understand completely." She smiled, satisfied that she'd successfully broken the old woman's spirit.
Good.
"And next time we entertain, maybe you should consider hiring professional help. It's clear you're not up to the task anymore." After she left, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the aftermath of the worst Thanksgiving of my life. The house felt different now, contaminated by Lauren's cruelty and my son's cowardice. But I wasn't broken. I was focused. People think revenge is hot, that it burns like fire and consumes everything in its path. They're wrong. Real revenge is cold. It moves slowly, freezes quietly, and then cracks a life open without warning. Lauren thought she destroyed me that night. In reality, she'd just awakened something that had been sleeping since Charles died, the part of me that knew how to fight, how to plan, how to win. My late husband had been one of the most successful attorneys in the state. For 37 years, I'd watched him prepare cases, strategize victories, and destroy his opponents with nothing more dangerous than the truth and superior preparation. I'd learned more about law and strategy sitting at Charles's dinner table than most people learn in law school. Lauren had just given me a case worth prosecuting. By morning, her world would begin to crumble. And it would be my hand pressing every stone loose. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke at 5 a.m. with the clarity that only comes from having a purpose. While Lauren was probably sleeping off her wine-fueled triumph, I was making coffee and beginning the most important research project of my life. I'd spent 3 years watching my daughter-in-law from the periphery, making polite conversation at family gatherings and trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. But peripheral observation and enemy analysis are two very different disciplines. Now I needed to understand Lauren Price with the thoroughness of a military strategist. I started with what I knew for certain. Lauren had married my son 3 years ago, not because she loved him, but because he represented security and social elevation. Michael was a successful attorney with prospects for partnership at his firm, old family money, and a mother who owned prime real estate in the city's most desirable neighborhood. Lauren had been 29 then, beautiful and ambitious, working her way up at Davidson and Associates through a combination of genuine competence and strategic charm. She targeted Michael at a charity fundraiser, pursued him with a single-minded focus of a hunter tracking prey, and married him in a ceremony that cost more than most people's houses. The marriage had been a calculated business transaction disguised as romance. But Lauren had made one critical miscalculation. She'd assumed I would die soon, leaving her free to inherit the house, the money, and the social position that came with being the surviving matriarch of the Cross family. She'd been wrong on all counts. At 64, I was in excellent health, financially secure, and had no intention of departing this life to accommodate her timeline. My longevity had become an obstacle to her plans, which explained the escalating cruelty I'd witnessed over the past year. The Thanksgiving humiliation hadn't been spontaneous. It had been a deliberate attempt to establish dominance, to put me in my place before her parents and our social circle. Lauren wanted everyone to understand that she was now the power in this family, and that I was nothing more than an inconvenient relic to be managed or discarded. What she didn't understand was that she'd just declared war on someone who'd been studying conflict resolution for 4 decades. I pulled out the files I'd kept on my son's marriage, not because I was suspicious, but because Charles had trained me to document everything important. Financial records, social media posts, newspaper clippings from Lauren's professional achievements, even photographs from family gatherings. Spread across my dining room table, the evidence told a fascinating story. Lauren's salary at Davidson and Associates was substantial, approximately $180,000 annually according to the tax returns Michael had mentioned during casual conversation. But her spending pattern suggested an income nearly double that amount. The BMW she drove cost $85,000. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of designer pieces, each costing thousands of dollars. The jewelry she wore to casual family dinners was worth more than most people's engagement rings. The house she and Michael lived in had been purchased for $750,000, with a mortgage that should have been stretching their budget even with both incomes combined. Yet Lauren showed no signs of financial stress. She shopped constantly, traveled internationally, and had recently been photographed at charity galas wearing gowns that cost more than I spent on groceries in a year. Charles had taught me that when someone's lifestyle doesn't match their documented income, there are only 3 possibilities: hidden income sources, inherited wealth, or theft. Lauren's parents were wealthy, but had publicly stated their belief in making their children earn their own way in the world. No inheritance there. Hidden income sources were possible, but would require investigation. That left theft. I called Judge Franklin Moore that afternoon. "Franklin, it's Vivian Cross. I hope you and Dorothy had a lovely Thanksgiving." "Vivian, my dear, after what we witnessed yesterday, I've been worried about you. That young woman's behavior was absolutely inexcusable." "I appreciate your concern, Franklin. Actually, I was hoping to ask your advice on a legal matter." Franklin had presided over hundreds of white-collar crime cases during his 30 years on the bench. He understood financial fraud the way surgeons understand anatomy, with intimate, precise knowledge of how systems could be corrupted. If someone were systematically embezzling from their employer, I said carefully, what would be the most effective way to expose and prosecute such behavior? "Hypothetically speaking, of course." "Of course." "Well, embezzlement cases are typically built on paper trails. Bank records, expense reports, client account discrepancies. The perpetrator usually believes they're too smart to be caught, so they leave extensive evidence. The key is having someone with forensic accounting skills review the records and identify the patterns." "And if someone wanted to report suspected embezzlement?" "Most firms have internal audit departments, but if the theft is sophisticated, you'd want to contact the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. They have resources that can trace money through multiple accounts and jurisdictions." That evening, I called Cynthia Hale, my accountant and one of Charles's oldest friends. Cynthia was 57. sharp as a razor, and specialized in forensic accounting for divorce attorneys and criminal defense lawyers. Cynthia, I need a favor. A rather significant one. Anything for you, Vivian. What do you need? I suspect someone close to the family is committing financial fraud. I need documentation that would hold up in court. How close to the family? Close enough that I want them destroyed completely. Cynthia was quiet for a moment. Vivian, that doesn't sound like you. It's exactly like me, Cynthia. I've just been polite for too long. We met the next morning at her office. I brought everything I had on Lauren: photographs, social media screenshots, casual mentions of purchases, and expenses that Michael had shared over family dinners. This is interesting, Cynthia said, studying the timeline I'd created. Her spending has increased dramatically over the past 18 months, but there's no corresponding increase in documented income. And look at this pattern. Large expenditures always follow by a few days any mention of big client wins or successful portfolio management. What does that suggest? It suggests she's celebrating successful thefts. When she steals money, she rewards herself immediately. It's a classic pattern. Cynthia's husband Richard was a retired police detective who now worked as a private investigator. Between the three of us, we had the skills to build an airtight case against Lauren. Richard can get the banking records and track her spending patterns, Cynthia explained. I can analyze the financial data for signs of embezzlement. And you can provide the personal observations that establish motive and opportunity. How long will this take? If she's as careless as her spending suggests, probably 6 weeks. Maybe less. And if we find evidence of embezzlement, then your daughter-in-law goes to federal prison for a very long time.
Perfect.
That night, I sat in Charles's study, surrounded by his law books and case files, planning Lauren's destruction with the same methodical precision he'd used to win his most important cases. Lauren thought she'd humiliated me into submission. She had no idea that humiliation was just another form of motivation, and that the quiet widow she dismissed as useless had just begun the most important legal case of her life. The plaintiff, my dignity; the defendant, her freedom; the verdict, inevitable. Some people collect stamps or butterflies. I was about to collect evidence. And when I was finished, Lauren Price would discover that there are worse things than being called useless, like being called an inmate. Before we continue with Vivian's calculated revenge, I want to share something powerful with you. If you've ever been told you're too old to start over, let me tell you, that's a lie. Your story isn't over, and you still have chapters left to write. Our best-selling book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, is filled with simple, powerful steps to help you heal, rebuild, and fall in love with life again. Click the link in the description box and start your new beginning today. Vivian's story shows us that being underestimated can be your greatest weapon. Like this video if you've ever been dismissed because of your age. Subscribe for more stories of people who turned humiliation into victory, and hit that notification bell because Vivian's revenge is about to get ice cold and absolutely devastating. People assume that age equals powerlessness. They see gray hair and think fragility, see 64 years and imagine irrelevance. Lauren Price had made that fatal assumption about me, and it was going to cost her everything. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd spent the last 4 decades building the kind of quiet influence that can topple empires. While she'd been perfecting her smile and learning to steal, I'd been watching, learning, and accumulating the kind of allies that can destroy a person's life with nothing more than a phone call. Charles had been one of the most respected attorneys in the state, but his real power had come from his ability to see 3 moves ahead and his network of professionals who owed him favors. When he died, I'd inherited more than his estate. I'd inherited his reputation, his connections, and his understanding of how the world really worked. The morning after my conversation with Cynthia and Richard, I began making calls. My first contact was Detective Mark Turner, a former client of Charles's who now headed the Financial Crimes Division of the State Police. Charles had gotten Mark's son out of a drunk driving charge 15 years ago, saving the boy's military career and Mark's family reputation. Mrs. Cross, what a pleasure to hear from you. How can I help? Mark, I have reason to believe someone is embezzling from a major financial firm in the city. I want to make sure the information reaches the right people when the time comes. Are we talking about substantial amounts? Potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. That's federal territory, Mrs. Cross. But I have contacts at the FBI who handle these cases. When you're ready to move forward, give me a call. My second call was to Sandra Wells, the investigative reporter who'd covered Charles's biggest cases for the city newspaper. Sandra was 45 now, sharp as a blade, and always interested in stories that involved powerful people behaving badly. Vivian, I was just thinking about you the other day. How are you holding up? I'm well, Sandra. I may have a story for you soon. Financial fraud at a major investment firm with connections to some prominent local families. Now you have my attention. How prominent are we talking? The kind of prominent that makes headlines and sells newspapers. Keep me posted, Vivian. You know I love a good scandal. My third call was to Patricia Vance, who sat on the board of Davidson and Associates, the firm where Lauren worked. Patricia was 72, old family money, and had been Charles's client when her late husband's business partner tried to steal their company. Vivian, dear, how lovely to hear from you. Patricia, I need to ask you about your company's internal audit procedures. Hypothetically, if someone suspected an employee of embezzlement, what would be the proper channels for reporting it? Well, we have an internal compliance department, but for serious financial crimes, we'd involve outside auditors and law enforcement immediately. The firm's reputation is everything, Vivian. We can't afford even the appearance of impropriety.
Perfect.
Lauren worked for a company that would throw her under the bus the moment they suspected financial misconduct. Over the next week, Richard began his investigation. He was 68 but moved like a man 20 years younger, with a patient persistence that had made him one of the city's best detectives. Mrs. Cross, he reported after 3 days of surveillance, your daughter-in-law has some interesting habits. She makes regular stops at a bank branch across town from her office, always on days when she's supposed to be meeting with major clients. What kind of stops? Safety deposit box access. Whatever she's doing in there, she doesn't want it connected to her primary banking relationship. Even more interesting was Lauren's spending pattern. Richard had tracked her purchases for a week and discovered that she paid for her expensive lifestyle entirely in cash or through a credit card that wasn't connected to any of the accounts she shared with Michael. She's got a shadow financial life, Richard explained. Separate accounts, separate credit cards, separate safety deposit boxes. The only reason to maintain that level of separation is if you're hiding income from someone, either your husband or the IRS. Or both, I added. While Richard was tracking Lauren's movements, Cynthia was analyzing her public financial footprint. Davidson and Associates was publicly traded, which meant their employee compensation data was available through securities filings. Executive salary ranges were disclosed, and Lauren's lifestyle far exceeded what someone in her position should have been able to afford. Vivian, I've run the numbers 6 different ways, Cynthia reported. Even if Lauren was the highest paid person in her position at the firm, and even if Michael was contributing his entire salary to their household expenses, they still couldn't afford their current lifestyle. The math doesn't work unless she has access to money that isn't being reported. How much money are we talking about? Conservatively, she's spending about $300,000 more per year than her documented income would support. Over the past 3 years, that's nearly $1 million in unaccounted for expenditures. $1 million. Lauren hadn't just been skimming, she'd been systematically looting her clients' accounts for years. But I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof that would satisfy federal prosecutors and destroy her life completely. That's when I remembered Charles's most important lesson about warfare. Never attack your enemy where they're strong. Attack where they're weak, where they think they're safe. Lauren's weakness wasn't her embezzlement. She'd probably been careful about covering her tracks electronically. Her weakness was her arrogance. She'd gotten away with theft for so long that she'd stopped being cautious. She was spending stolen money openly, flaunting her wealth, documenting her crimes on social media for the world to see. I spent an evening going through 3 years of Lauren's Instagram and Facebook posts, screenshotting every image of expensive purchases, luxury vacations, and designer accessories. Each post was dated and geotagged, creating a timeline of expenditures that could be cross-referenced with her work schedule and client meetings. The pattern that emerged was damning. Every major purchase coincided with Lauren handling a significant client transaction. She would post photos of herself at expensive restaurants or wearing new jewelry within days of her company announcing major investment victories. She was celebrating her thefts in real time, creating a public record of her crimes that any prosecutor could use to establish motive and timing. But I still needed access to her work records, and that's where my old-fashioned approach to relationship building paid off. Judge Franklin Moore had lunch every Tuesday with Harrison Davidson, the founding partner of Davidson and Associates. They'd been college roommates 60 years ago and had maintained their friendship through decades of success and loss. "Franklin," I said during our coffee meeting, "I need you to have a casual conversation with Harrison about employee theft. Nothing specific, just a general discussion about how firms protect themselves from internal fraud." "May I ask why?" "Because sometimes the most dangerous threats come from the people you trust most." Franklin understood immediately. He'd seen enough cases to know that employee theft was usually an inside job committed by people who had access and opportunity, who understood the system well enough to exploit its weaknesses. "I'll see what I can learn, Vivian. But if you're building a case against someone, you need to be very careful. Accusations of financial fraud can destroy innocent people if you're wrong." "I'm not wrong, Franklin. And I'm not making accusations. I'm gathering evidence." 2 weeks later, Franklin called with news that made my blood sing with anticipation. Harrison mentioned that the firm has been conducting internal audits because some client accounts showed unexplained fluctuations. Nothing they could pinpoint, but enough to make them nervous. He said they're bringing in outside forensic accountants to review all portfolio management activities. Lauren was already under investigation, but she didn't know it yet. The firm was closing in on her, and when they found what I knew they would find, she wouldn't just lose her job, she'd face federal charges for embezzling from client accounts. All I had to do was wait for the trap to spring. But waiting has never been my strong suit, especially when I could accelerate the process. It was time to provide Davidson and Associates with some additional evidence to speed up their investigation. Anonymous tips had a way of focusing audit attention on specific employees, specific transactions, specific patterns of behavior. Lauren thought she was hunting me, slowly maneuvering to push me out of my own family and claim my position as matriarch. She had no idea that she was actually the prey, and that the quiet old woman she'd humiliated was the predator who'd been circling her for weeks. Revenge isn't fire, it's ice. And I was about to give Lauren the coldest surprise of her privileged, entitled, criminal life. The art of anonymous information sharing is more delicate than people realize. Too aggressive, and you're dismissed as a crank with an agenda. Too subtle, and your target escapes justice. The key is to provide just enough verifiable information to trigger a legitimate investigation, then step back and let professional auditors do what they do best. I'd spent 2 weeks crafting the perfect anonymous letter to Davidson and Associates Compliance Department. Not an accusation, those are easy to ignore, but a concerned inquiry from a friend of the firm who'd noticed some troubling coincidences. The letter, typed on generic paper with no distinguishing marks, highlighted three specific concerns. First, that Lauren Price's lifestyle appeared inconsistent with her documented salary. I included specific examples that could be verified through public records. The BMW registration, property tax records showing her home value, and photographs from charity galas where she wore jewelry worth more than most people's annual income. Second, that her social media posts consistently showed major purchases coinciding with her handling of significant client accounts. I provided dates, screenshots, and transaction timelines that any auditor could cross-reference with the firm's internal records. Third, that she maintained financial accounts at institutions not typically used by the firm's employees. The bank branch Richard had observed her visiting regularly, accessed always during business hours when she should have been serving clients. I sealed the letter, drove to a post office in the next county, and mailed it using a stamp I'd purchased with cash. No fingerprints, no DNA, no way to trace it back to me. The letter would arrive at Davidson and Associates on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Lauren's life would begin unraveling in ways she couldn't possibly anticipate. But I wasn't content to wait for corporate wheels to turn. While the firm's audit department was processing anonymous tips, I wanted to ensure that law enforcement was prepared to act when evidence emerged. Detective Mark Turner and I met for coffee at a small cafe across town from my usual haunts. I wore sunglasses and a scarf, not because I was afraid of being recognized, but because I wanted to maintain the discipline of operational security that Charles had taught me. Mrs. Cross, you mentioned suspected embezzlement. What's the timeline you're looking at? The investigation should begin within the next few days. When it does, the firm will discover systematic theft from client accounts over a period of several years. I estimate the total amount stolen at close to $1 million. Mark whistled softly. That's federal territory for sure. Who's the suspect? I handed him a folder containing Lauren's public information, employment history, social media profiles, property records, and the spending timeline Cynthia had compiled. Lauren Price, Senior Portfolio Manager at Davidson and Associates. She's been living far beyond her documented means and has been careless about documenting her crimes on social media. Mark reviewed the materials with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen dozens of embezzlement cases. This is solid preliminary work, Mrs. Cross. When the firm discovers the theft, and they will, we'll be ready to move quickly. What happens next? Once the firm reports the embezzlement, we'll coordinate with the FBI and the district attorney's office. Someone who's stolen this much money over this long a period is looking at serious federal time. 10 to 15 years minimum. 15 years in federal prison. Lauren would be 47 when she was released, her beauty faded, her career destroyed, her reputation permanently stained by felony convictions.
Perfect.
That weekend, I attended a charity luncheon where I knew Lauren would be present. She was scheduled to speak about fiscal responsibility in uncertain times. The irony was delicious. I watched her work the room with practiced charm, networking with potential clients and social contacts who could advance her career. She was radiant in a dress that probably cost more than most people made in a month, jewelry that could fund a small business, confidence that came from believing she was untouchable. During her speech, Lauren talked about the importance of trust in financial relationships, about how investors needed to know their money was in safe hands. She spoke eloquently about fiduciary responsibility and the sacred trust between financial advisors and their clients. Every word was a lie, delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who'd been stealing from those same clients for years. After her speech, Lauren approached me with a kind of smile predators use when they think they've successfully intimidated their prey. Vivian, how lovely to see you. I hope you're feeling better after our little misunderstanding on Thanksgiving. Little misunderstanding. As if publicly humiliating me in front of 24 guests was just a minor social friction. I'm feeling quite well, Lauren. Your speech was very enlightening. Thank you. I do think it's important for people to understand how financial markets really work. Oh, I'm learning more about finance every day. It's fascinating how money moves through different accounts, how transactions can be tracked across multiple institutions, how digital footprints make it almost impossible to hide financial impropriety. Something flickered behind Lauren's eyes. Not quite suspicion, but a momentary uncertainty that told me my words had found their mark. That's very true, she said carefully. Transparency is essential in our business. I'm sure your clients appreciate that transparency, Lauren. Though I imagine it must be challenging to maintain such high standards when there are so many temptations in your field. I'm not sure what you mean. Oh, nothing specific. I just imagine that someone with access to large amounts of other people's money might occasionally be tempted to blur the lines between their clients' assets and their own needs. Lauren's smile became strained. That would be theft, Vivian. It's also a federal crime. Yes, I said pleasantly. It certainly would be. I excused myself and walked away, leaving Lauren standing in the middle of the charity luncheon with the expression of someone who just realized the harmless old woman might not be as harmless as she appeared. That evening, Michael called me, his voice tight with tension. Mother, Lauren said you made some very strange comments to her today. Something about financial impropriety and theft. Did I? I don't recall saying anything strange. We were just discussing her speech about fiscal responsibility. She seemed to think you were making some kind of accusation. Michael, I would never accuse anyone of anything without evidence to support such serious allegations. Lauren must have misunderstood our conversation. She's very upset, Mother. She thinks you're trying to create problems for her at work. Why would Lauren be concerned about our casual conversation affecting her work? Unless, of course, she has something to hide. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Mother, what's really going on here? What's going on, Michael, is that your wife publicly humiliated me in front of our entire social circle, and I'm beginning to wonder what kind of person I've welcomed into our family. That was deliberate cruelty, Michael. And people who are cruel to vulnerable family members are often cruel in other areas of their lives as well. After I hung up, I sat in Charles's study and smiled. Lauren was nervous now, worried that the quiet widow she dismissed might actually pose a threat. She'd spent the weekend wondering what I meant by my comments about financial transparency, about the difficulty of hiding impropriety in the digital age.
Good.
Nervous people make mistakes, and I wanted Lauren to be very nervous when the audit team at Davidson and Associates began asking questions about her client accounts. Monday morning, my anonymous letter would reach the firm's compliance department. Monday afternoon, professional auditors would begin reviewing Lauren's work with a kind of thorough attention that exposed even the most sophisticated theft. By the end of the week, Lauren Price would understand that there are consequences for humiliating people who have nothing left to lose except their dignity. And dignity, as she was about to learn, can be a very dangerous thing to take from someone who knows how to fight back. Monday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of an execution. I woke at dawn, made coffee, and sat in my kitchen imagining Lauren getting ready for work, applying her perfect makeup, choosing jewelry paid for with stolen money, preparing for what she thought would be another ordinary day of theft disguised as portfolio management. She had no idea that 40 miles away, a compliance officer at Davidson and Associates was opening an envelope that would destroy her life. I spent the morning gardening, pulling weeds and pruning roses with the same methodical precision I'd used to plan Lauren's downfall. Physical work has always helped me think clearly, and I wanted to be centered when the inevitable call came. At 11:47 a.m., my phone rang. Michael's number. Mother, something's happening at Lauren's office. She called me in tears, saying they've suspended her pending some kind of investigation. I set down my gardening shears and walked into the house, my voice carefully neutral. What kind of investigation? She doesn't know. HR called her into a meeting this morning with some external auditors and a lawyer from the firm's compliance department. They had files full of documentation about her work, questions about client accounts, something about irregularities in transaction patterns. That sounds serious. Mother, they suspended her immediately. They escorted her out of the building and told her not to contact any clients or colleagues while the investigation is ongoing. Her access to all firm systems has been revoked.
Perfect.
Davidson and Associates was following exactly the protocol I'd hoped they would. Immediate suspension, preservation of evidence, isolation of the suspect from potential accomplices or additional victims. Did they give her any indication of what they're investigating? That's the thing, Mother. They were very specific. They're looking into potential embezzlement from client accounts, unauthorized transactions, and misappropriation of firm assets. They mentioned having received information from external sources, suggesting financial impropriety. External sources. My anonymous letter had found its target and triggered exactly the response I'd intended. Well, I'm sure if Lauren hasn't done anything wrong, the investigation will clear her name quickly. But what if? Michael's voice cracked. Mother, what if she did do something wrong? Then she'll face the consequences of her choices, Michael. That's how justice works. That afternoon, Lauren herself called me. Her voice was shaky, stripped of the confidence that had carried her through 3 years of theft and arrogance. Vivian, I need to talk to you. Can I come over? Of course, dear. I'll put on some tea. She arrived 20 minutes later, driving the BMW that would probably be repossessed within the month. Gone was the perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup. Lauren looked haggard, desperate, like someone who'd just realized that the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. I opened the door and led her into the same living room where she'd humiliated me 6 days earlier. The irony was exquisite. Vivian, I need your help, she said, her voice breaking. Something terrible is happening at work. They think I've been stealing from client accounts. How awful for you. Why would they think such a thing? I don't know. Someone sent them information about my personal finances, about my spending patterns. They have documentation going back 3 years, showing every major purchase I've made, every vacation, every piece of jewelry. I poured tea with steady hands, my face showing nothing but elderly concern. That does sound very thorough. Who would have access to that kind of information is about your personal life? That's what I can't figure out. The compliance officer said they received an anonymous tip with detailed documentation. Someone has been watching me, tracking my spending, building a case against me for months. Well, if you haven't done anything wrong, surely the investigation will clear everything up. Lauren's hands were shaking as she reached for her teacup. Vivian, I need you to know that Michael doesn't have anything to do with this. Whatever they think I've done, he's completely innocent. Interesting. Lauren was already preparing her defense, distancing Michael from her crimes. She knew she was guilty, and she was trying to protect the only asset she thought she had left, her marriage to my son. I'm sure Michael will support you through this difficult time, Lauren. That's what marriage is for. The thing is, Lauren continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, I may have made some mistakes, some poor financial decisions. But I never meant to hurt anyone. Poor financial decisions. Even now, facing federal prosecution, Lauren couldn't admit the truth about what she'd done. What kind of mistakes, dear? I may have borrowed money from client accounts occasionally, just temporarily, when I needed cash flow for personal expenses. I always intended to pay it back. There it was. The confession I'd been waiting for, delivered in my own living room while I served tea and played the role of the sympathetic mother-in-law. How much money are we talking about, Lauren? Over the years? Maybe $800,000. But it was never permanent. I was just using the accounts like a temporary loan service. $800,000. She'd admitted to stealing nearly $1 million from her clients, and she was characterizing it as borrowing and poor financial decisions. Lauren, that sounds like embezzlement. It's not embezzlement if you intend to pay it back. I was going to replace all the money eventually, when my investments paid off. What investments? I've been using the money to fund some private ventures. High-risk, high-reward opportunities that weren't suitable for client portfolios, but that I knew would pay off eventually. She'd been gambling with stolen money. Not content with simply embezzling from her clients, Lauren had been using their funds to make speculative investments, probably losing more than she'd stolen. Did any of these investments pay off? Lauren's silence told me everything I needed to know. So you stole $800,000 from your clients, lost it all on bad investments, and now you can't pay any of it back? It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, Lauren. You're a thief who gambled away other people's money, and now you're facing federal prison. The mask finally slipped completely. Lauren's composure cracked, and I saw the desperate criminal beneath the polished exterior. Vivian, please. I need you to help me. Talk to Michael. Convince him to stand by me. I need character witnesses, people who can testify that this isn't who I really am. Isn't it? What? Isn't this exactly who you are, Lauren? Someone who takes what doesn't belong to her? Someone who humiliates people weaker than herself? Someone who uses charm and manipulation to get what she wants? Lauren stared at me, and I saw the moment she realized that the sympathetic elderly widow was actually her worst enemy. You, she whispered. You did this to me. I did nothing to you, Lauren. I simply provided Davidson and Associates with publicly available information about your lifestyle and spending patterns. Information that any competent auditor would have discovered eventually. You've been watching me, tracking my purchases, building a case against me. I've been protecting my family from someone who thought she could steal from clients, humiliate her mother-in-law, and face no consequences for either behavior. Lauren stood up shakily. You can't prove anything. It's your word against mine. Actually, it's the FBI's forensic accounting evidence against your signed confession that you just gave me about borrowing $800,000 from client accounts. I didn't confess to anything, Lauren. Dear, you admitted to taking money from client accounts without authorization. You admitted to using those funds for personal investments. You admitted that you lost the money and can't pay it back. That's called embezzlement, and it's a federal crime. The color drained from Lauren's face as she realized what she'd done. In her desperation to gain my sympathy and support, she'd confessed to federal crimes in explicit detail. You're not going to tell anyone what I said. That was a private conversation. Lauren, I'm 64 years old and have no legal obligation to keep your criminal confessions confidential. In fact, I have a moral obligation to ensure that law enforcement knows the full scope of your crimes. She backed toward the door, her perfect composure completely shattered. You evil old bitch. You planned this whole thing. I planned nothing, Lauren. I simply allowed you to demonstrate exactly who you are. You chose to steal from your clients. You chose to humiliate me publicly. You chose to confess your crimes in my living room. All I did was create opportunities for you to reveal your true character. This isn't over. I'll fight this. I'll hire the best lawyers money can buy. With what money, dear? The money you stole has been lost on bad investments. The money you earn is about to stop when you're fired and criminally prosecuted. And the money Michael has access to will be frozen once the FBI begins investigating your joint assets for evidence of money laundering. Lauren stumbled out of my house like a woman walking away from a car crash, which, in a sense, she was. The crash had been her life, and she'd just realized that the harmless old woman she'd humiliated was actually the engineer who'd removed all the safety barriers. I cleaned up the tea service and called Detective Mark Turner. Mark, it's Vivian Cross. I have some additional information about the Lauren Price embezzlement case. What kind of information? A detailed confession, including the amount stolen and the suspect's admission that she can't repay any of the missing funds. She confessed to you? She came to my house seeking sympathy and support. Instead, she provided me with everything law enforcement needs to ensure her conviction. Mrs. Cross, you've just made our case airtight. When the FBI interviews her, she won't be able to claim innocence or ignorance. Her own words will convict her. That evening, I sat in Charles's study with a glass of wine, reviewing the events of the day with the satisfaction of a chess player who'd just achieved checkmate. Lauren had walked into my house believing she could manipulate the elderly widow into supporting her defense against embezzlement charges. Instead, she confessed to federal crimes in detail, provided information that would accelerate her prosecution, and demonstrated the exact character flaws that would make any jury despise her. Tomorrow, Davidson and Associates would complete their audit and discover the full scope of Lauren's theft. Within a week, federal prosecutors would have enough evidence to ensure her conviction and a lengthy prison sentence. And it had all started with my anonymous letter, carefully crafted to trigger the investigation that would expose her crimes. Some people think revenge requires anger, passion, emotion. They're wrong. The best revenge is cold, calculated, and completely legal. It requires patience, planning, and the willingness to let your enemy destroy themselves while you provide just enough pressure to accelerate their downfall. Lauren had humiliated me in front of 23 guests. Tomorrow, she'd be humiliated in front of the entire city when her arrest made the evening news. The scales were finally balanced. The headline appeared in Tuesday morning's business section. Davidson and Associates executive suspended amid embezzlement investigation. By Tuesday afternoon, it had moved to the front page. Local woman accused of stealing nearly $1 million from investment clients. I read both articles over breakfast, savoring my coffee and the exquisite precision of professional journalism. Sandra Wells had done her job beautifully, turning the basic facts of Lauren's suspension into a comprehensive exposé of financial fraud at one of the city's most prestigious firms. The article included everything I'd hoped it would: Lauren's employment history, the scope of the alleged theft, quotes from anonymous sources within Davidson and Associates describing the extensive evidence against her. Most deliciously, it included a photograph of Lauren from a charity gala 2 months earlier, wearing a diamond necklace that, according to the article, cost more than the average person's annual salary. By noon, the story had been picked up by the state's major newspapers and television stations. By evening, it was trending on social media with hashtags like #EmbezzlementBarbie and #StealingInStyle. Lauren's public humiliation was complete and permanent. Every potential employer, every social contact, every person who might ever Google her name would find detailed coverage of her crimes. The beautiful, successful facade she'd spent years constructing had been demolished in a single news cycle. My phone rang constantly as friends and neighbors called to express their shock about Lauren's arrest and their concern for my family. I played the role of the devastated mother-in-law perfectly, expressing surprise and disappointment while subtly reinforcing the narrative that Lauren had always seemed troubled. I always wondered how she could afford that lifestyle on her salary. I told Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor and one of the city's most efficient gossips. But Michael always said she was just very good with money. Well, she was good with other people's money, apparently. Mrs. Patterson replied with the kind of vicious satisfaction that only comes from watching the mighty fall. The most satisfying call came from Eleanor Price, Lauren's mother, whose voice was tight with panic and social humiliation. "Vivian, this is a nightmare. Our family's reputation is being destroyed by these allegations. I'm sure this is very difficult for you, Eleanor. Though I imagine it's been difficult for Lauren's clients as well, losing their life savings to fund her shopping habits. We need to present a united family front. Can you make a statement to the press about Lauren's character? What would you like me to say, Eleanor? That she's always been honest and trustworthy? That she treats family members with respect and kindness? The silence on the other end told me Eleanor remembered exactly how Lauren had treated me at Thanksgiving dinner. Or perhaps you'd like me to discuss how she threw plates on my dining room floor and screamed at me in front of our guests. I'm sure that would provide excellent character evidence. Vivian, please. We're all family here. Eleanor, your daughter chose to humiliate me publicly. She chose to steal from her clients systematically. She chose to confess her crimes to me while seeking my help. None of those were family decisions, they were criminal decisions. And criminals face consequences regardless of their family connections. Wednesday brought news that Davidson and Associates had completed their audit and discovered the full scope of Lauren's theft. The firm issued a statement confirming that approximately $1.2 million had been stolen from client accounts over a 3-year period and that they were cooperating fully with federal investigators. More importantly, the firm announced that they were filing a civil lawsuit against Lauren to recover the stolen funds and that they were liquidating all her assets to compensate the victimized clients. The BMW, the house, the jewelry, the designer clothes, everything Lauren had purchased with stolen money would be seized and sold. Thursday brought the arrest. I was having lunch with Judge Franklin Moore when his phone buzzed with a text from a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Vivian, they've just taken Lauren Price into federal custody. She was arrested at home this morning on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and theft from federally insured financial institutions. Federal charges. That meant federal prison, federal sentencing guidelines, and no possibility of early release for good behavior. What's the timeline for prosecution? Grand jury indictment within 2 weeks, arraignment shortly after that. Given the strength of the evidence and the amount stolen, I'd expect plea negotiations to begin immediately. She's looking at 10 to 15 years if convicted on all counts. 15 years in federal prison. Lauren would be 47 when she was released, her beauty faded, her career destroyed, her reputation permanently stained by felony convictions. The evening news featured footage of Lauren being led from her house in handcuffs, her perfect blonde hair disheveled, her designer outfit wrinkled from a night in federal custody. The same woman who'd screamed at me for being useless was now being documented by news cameras as she was processed into the federal justice system. Michael called me that evening, his voice hollow with shock and betrayal. Mother, I can't believe this is happening. The FBI seized everything, our house, our cars, our bank accounts. They're treating me like a co-conspirator. Are you a co-conspirator, Michael? Of course not. I had no idea Lauren was stealing money from her clients. I thought her salary was just higher than she'd told me. What did you think when she bought an $85,000 car and a $750,000 house on a $180,000 salary?
I didn't think about it.
She said she was good with investments, that she'd made smart financial decisions. My son was either incredibly naive or deliberately ignorant. Either way, he'd chosen to marry a woman whose lifestyle should have raised obvious questions about the source of her income. Michael, what are you going to do now? I don't know. My law firm is conducting their own investigation to make sure I wasn't involved in any of Lauren's activities. I may lose my job even if I'm not charged with anything.
Good.
Professional consequences for Michael would complete the destruction of Lauren's social network and ensure that she faced her legal troubles completely alone. Mother, I need to ask you something. What's that? Lauren thinks you had something to do with this investigation. She says you've been watching her, gathering information about her finances. Michael, do you think your elderly mother is capable of conducting a sophisticated financial investigation that exposed nearly $1 million in embezzlement? When you put it that way, it sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous. The FBI has forensic accountants, digital investigators, and financial crime specialists. They don't need help from 64-year-old widows to catch embezzlers. It is ridiculous. The FBI has forensic accountants, digital investigators, and financial crime specialists. They don't need help from 64-year-old widows to catch embezzlers. But the timing seems suspicious. She humiliated you at Thanksgiving, and now she's been arrested for crimes that supposedly went on for years. Michael, Lauren's crimes caught up with her because she got careless and greedy. She was spending stolen money openly, documenting her theft on social media, living a lifestyle that any competent auditor would have questioned eventually. The only suspicious thing is that it took this long for someone to notice. After I hung up, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. 6 days ago, Lauren Price had been a successful financial executive with a promising career and a wealthy lifestyle. Tonight, she was sitting in a federal holding cell, facing years in prison and complete financial ruin. The transformation had been swift, thorough, and completely legal. I'd simply provided the right information to the right people at the right time, then allowed the justice system to function as it was designed. Some people might call what I'd done vindictive. I called it educational. Lauren had needed to learn that actions have consequences, that humiliating vulnerable people carries risks, and that stealing money from clients while living an extravagant lifestyle is remarkably stupid. She'd learned all those lessons in the course of a single week. Tomorrow would bring news of the formal charges, the arraignment, and the beginning of Lauren's journey through the federal court system. Her lawyers would try to negotiate a plea agreement, but with her recorded confession to me and the overwhelming evidence of systematic theft, they'd have very little leverage. I watered my roses and planned my evening meal, a woman finally at peace with the knowledge that justice had been served and balance had been restored. Lauren had thrown plates on my floor and called me a useless old woman. Now she was the one who'd been broken into pieces, and I was the one who'd proven that usefulness has nothing to do with age and everything to do with knowing how to fight back. Friday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything seem sharper, more defined. I was in my garden, deadheading roses and preparing the beds for winter, when I heard the distant sound of sirens. Multiple vehicles, moving fast, heading toward the wealthy neighborhood where Lauren and Michael lived. I smiled and continued my gardening. Timing, as Charles always said, is everything in both law and life. At 9:23 a.m., my phone rang. Michael's number, but the voice was Lauren's, shaky, desperate, barely controlled. "Vivian, they're here. The FBI is at my house with a warrant. They're going through everything, my computer, my files, my financial records." "How terrible for you, dear. I'm sure if you've done nothing wrong, everything will be resolved quickly. They want to take me in for questioning. My lawyer says I should cooperate, but I'm scared. What if they twist my words? What if they recorded your confession in my living room 3 days ago? I thought but didn't say." "Lauren, just tell them the truth. The truth is always the best defense. The truth is that I made some mistakes, but I never meant to hurt anyone. I was going to pay everything back eventually." Even now, facing federal arrest, Lauren couldn't admit the reality of what she'd done. In her mind, systematic embezzlement was still just mistakes that she could somehow fix or minimize. "I have to go," she whispered. "They're asking me to come with them now." The line went dead. I set down my phone and returned to my roses, humming softly as I worked. Lauren Price was about to begin the most humiliating day of her privileged life, and I intended to enjoy every moment of it. An hour later, Sandra Wells called for a comment on Lauren's arrest. "Mrs. Cross, federal agents arrested your daughter-in-law this morning on charges related to embezzling over $1 million from her investment clients. As her family, do you have any statement about these allegations?" I chose my words carefully. playing the role of the shocked and disappointed family member while subtly reinforcing Lauren's guilt. Sandra, our family is devastated by these allegations. We had no idea that Lauren might be involved in financial impropriety. We're cooperating fully with law enforcement and hope that justice will be served for the clients who were victimized. Did you ever suspect that Lauren might be living beyond her means? I did notice that she seemed to have expensive tastes, but I assumed she was simply very successful in her career. It never occurred to me that she might be funding her lifestyle through theft. Some sources suggest that Lauren's spending habits were quite extravagant: luxury cars, expensive jewelry, designer clothes. As someone who knew her personally, do you think she might have felt entitled to live a lifestyle she couldn't afford?
Perfect.
Sandra was giving me the opportunity to establish Lauren's character publicly while maintaining my innocent elderly widow persona. I think Lauren always wanted the finer things in life, Sandra. There's nothing wrong with ambition, but there's definitely something wrong with stealing other people's money to fund your dreams. The interview would run in the evening edition, positioning me as the grieving family member who'd been deceived by Lauren's criminal behavior. It would also reinforce the narrative that Lauren was motivated by greed and entitlement rather than desperation or mental illness. At 2 p.m., the local television stations began running footage of Lauren's arrest. The images were everything I'd hoped they would be: Lauren in handcuffs, being led from her expensive house by federal agents while neighbors watched in shock and fascination. She was wearing the same designer dress she'd worn to humiliate me at Thanksgiving, but now it was wrinkled and inappropriate for federal custody. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared by tears, her entire carefully constructed image demolished by reality. The news reports included interviews with Lauren's former clients, many of whom were elderly retirees who'd lost their life savings to fund her shopping addiction. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, an 80-year-old widow, spoke through tears about losing $200,000 she'd set aside for her grandchildren's education. "I trusted her completely," Mrs. Walsh said. "She seemed so professional, so competent. I never imagined she was stealing my money to buy jewelry and cars." Other clients described similar losses: retirement funds, college savings, inheritance money that had been systematically stolen over 3 years, while Lauren smiled and assured them their investments were performing well. The human cost of Lauren's crimes was devastating. She hadn't just stolen money. She destroyed lives, ruined retirements, shattered the financial security of people who'd worked their entire lives to build modest wealth. That evening, I attended my book club meeting, where Lauren's arrest was naturally the primary topic of conversation. "Vivian, dear, we're all so sorry for what your family is going through," said Patricia Morrison, the club president. "It must be terrible to discover that someone you trusted was capable of such terrible crimes." "It's been very difficult, Patricia. I keep thinking about all the warning signs I should have noticed: the expensive lifestyle, the constant shopping, the way she seemed to have money for everything she wanted." "But who would suspect their own daughter-in-law of being a criminal?" added Ruth Hendricks. "We trust family members to be honest with us." "That's exactly why these crimes are so devastating," I replied. "Lauren didn't just steal money. She violated the trust of everyone who cared about her. She turned our love and support into weapons against us." The conversation continued for an hour, with each member expressing outrage at Lauren's betrayal and sympathy for the victimized clients. By the end of the evening, I'd successfully positioned myself as another victim of Lauren's deception rather than the architect of her downfall. Saturday morning brought news of Lauren's arraignment. She'd spent the night in federal custody and would appear before a magistrate judge to hear the formal charges against her. I decided to attend, not because I wanted to gloat, but because I wanted to witness the moment when Lauren finally understood the full scope of the consequences she faced. The federal courthouse was busy for a Saturday morning, filled with reporters, lawyers, and curious citizens who'd been following the story. I dressed carefully in my navy suit and pearls, looking like exactly what I was, a respectable elderly woman attending court proceedings that affected her family. Lauren appeared before Judge Morrison at 10 a.m., flanked by two public defenders who clearly understood they were fighting a losing battle. She was wearing an orange jumpsuit, her blonde hair pulled back in a prison-issued ponytail, her face pale and drawn from a night in federal custody. The prosecutor read the charges with clinical precision. Wire fraud, 18 counts. Money laundering, 12 counts. Theft from a federally insured financial institution, 23 counts. Bank fraud, 15 counts. Each charge carried significant prison time. Even with plea negotiations and cooperation with authorities, Lauren was facing at least 10 years in federal prison. How does the defendant plead? Judge Morrison asked. Not guilty, Your Honor. One of the public defenders responded, though his voice lacked conviction. The judge set bail at $500,000, requiring Lauren to surrender her passport and agree to electronic monitoring if she could raise the money. Given that all her assets had been seized as proceeds of crime, that seemed unlikely. As Lauren was led back to custody, she looked across the courtroom and saw me sitting in the gallery. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw recognition flicker across her face. She knew. Finally, completely, undeniably, she knew that the quiet elderly widow she'd humiliated was the person who'd destroyed her life. I didn't smile or acknowledge her in any way. I simply watched as the woman who'd called me useless was led away in shackles to await trial for crimes that would define the rest of her life. After the hearing, I drove home and spent the afternoon reading in my garden. The roses I'd been tending that morning were blooming beautifully, their colors bright against the autumn landscape. Lauren Price was sitting in a federal jail cell, facing decades in prison and the complete destruction of everything she'd stolen or achieved. Her beauty would fade in custody, her arrogance would be broken by prison reality, and her name would forever be associated with greed and betrayal. Most importantly, she would have years to think about the night she chose to humiliate an elderly widow and to consider whether her momentary cruelty had been worth the lifetime of consequences that followed. Some stories end with redemption and forgiveness. This one would end with justice and accountability. The difference, I was learning, is that justice doesn't require the victim to be generous or understanding. It only requires the truth to be revealed and consequences to be imposed. Lauren had revealed her true character that Thanksgiving night. Now she was facing the consequences of being exactly who she'd chosen to be. 3 months later, the trial of Lauren Price began with all the drama and media attention that financial crime cases rarely receive. The local newspapers had been following every development, turning Lauren's prosecution into a cautionary tale about greed, privilege, and the eventual consequences of betraying trust. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back row of the gallery, like a silent specter from Lauren's past. Each morning, I dressed carefully in my finest clothes and jewelry, presenting myself as the dignified family member who was committed to seeing justice done. Lauren had been unable to make bail, so she appeared in court each day, wearing the same ill-fitting navy suit that her overwhelmed public defenders had provided. 3 months in federal custody had changed her dramatically. Her blonde hair had lost its professional styling, her perfect makeup was gone, and her face showed the strain of someone who'd finally understood that charm and beauty couldn't save her from the consequences of systematic theft. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Vance, laid out their case with devastating precision. They presented evidence spanning 3 years of embezzlement, showing how Lauren had systematically stolen from client accounts while living an increasingly extravagant lifestyle. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Patricia said during her opening statement, this case is about betrayal. The defendant, Lauren Price, was entrusted with her clients' life savings, their retirement funds, their children's college money, their emergency reserves. Instead of protecting that trust, she stole over $1.2 million to fund her own luxurious lifestyle. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing unauthorized transfers from client accounts. Credit card statements documenting Lauren's expensive purchases on the same days she'd accessed client funds. Social media posts where she'd bragged about her designer clothes and luxury vacations, all paid for with stolen money. Most damaging was the timeline the prosecution presented, showing how Lauren's theft had escalated as her lifestyle became more expensive. What started as occasional borrowing of small amounts had grown into systematic looting of every account she managed. The victim testimony was heartbreaking. Elderly retirees who'd lost their life savings. Young families whose children's college funds had been stolen. Middle-aged workers whose retirement plans had been destroyed by Lauren's greed. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, the 80-year-old widow I'd seen on television, testified through tears about discovering that her $200,000 account had been emptied while Lauren assured her that her investments were performing exceptionally well. She seemed so professional, so trustworthy, Mrs. Walsh said. I gave her power of attorney over my account because I trusted her to protect my money. Instead, she stole everything I'd saved for my grandchildren's future. Other clients described similar betrayals. Lauren had specifically targeted vulnerable clients, elderly widows, recent retirees, people who didn't closely monitor their accounts because they trusted her professional expertise. The defense strategy was pathetic. Lauren's attorneys tried to argue that she'd intended to pay back the money, that her borrowing was unauthorized but not criminal in intent. They painted her as a troubled young woman who'd made poor decisions under financial pressure. But the evidence contradicted every aspect of their defense. Lauren hadn't been under financial pressure. She'd been living beyond her means by choice. She hadn't intended to pay back the money. She'd continued stealing even when her initial thefts could have been covered by selling her luxury possessions. Most importantly, her recorded confession to me had eliminated any possibility of claiming innocence or ignorance. On the third day of trial, the prosecution played the audio recording of Lauren's visit to my house. I'd anticipated this moment for months, knowing that her desperate confession would be the final nail in her legal coffin. I may have borrowed money from client accounts occasionally. Lauren's voice filled the courtroom through the prosecutor's speakers. Just temporarily, when I needed cash flow for personal expenses. I always intended to pay it back. How much money are we talking about, Lauren? My own voice, calm and elderly, encouraging her to continue. Over the years? Maybe $800,000. But it was never permanent. I was just using the accounts like a temporary loan service. The jury's reaction was visible. Several jurors shook their heads in disgust. Others stared at Lauren with expressions of pure contempt. She'd just convicted herself in her own words, admitting to systematic theft while trying to minimize it as borrowing. Lauren's face went white as she heard her own confession played back in federal court. She'd forgotten about my recording, had probably convinced herself that our conversation was protected by some kind of family privilege. She was wrong. I had no legal obligation to protect the confidentiality of criminal confessions, especially when they were made voluntarily by someone seeking my help in evading justice. The defense called character witnesses, Lauren's parents, former colleagues, Michael himself, all trying to convince the jury that Lauren was fundamentally a good person who'd made terrible mistakes. But their testimony only highlighted the scope of her deception. Her parents described Lauren as ambitious and driven, someone who'd always wanted the best things in life. Her colleagues talked about her professional competence and charm, inadvertently emphasizing how she'd used those qualities to deceive her clients. Michael's testimony was the most pathetic. He described Lauren as a loving wife who'd hidden her financial crimes from him completely. He begged the jury to show mercy, to consider that Lauren was young and could learn from her mistakes. But under cross-examination, The prosecution established that Michael had enjoyed the benefits of Lauren's stolen money without questioning its source. He'd lived in the expensive house, driven the luxury cars, attended the charity galas where Lauren wore jewelry worth more than most people's annual income. Mr. Cross, Patricia asked during her cross-examination, did you ever ask your wife how she could afford a BMW that cost more than her annual salary? I trusted her to manage our finances. She said she was good with investments. Did you think it was normal for a financial advisor to make enough money to afford a $750,000 house, designer clothes, and international vacations? I assumed she was very successful in her career. Michael's willful ignorance was almost as contemptible as Lauren's theft. He'd chosen not to ask questions because he'd enjoyed the lifestyle that Lauren's crimes had provided. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On the charge of wire fraud, count 1, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of wire fraud, count 2, we find the defendant guilty. The verdict continued for 30 minutes, guilty on every single count. Lauren collapsed in her chair, sobbing openly as the weight of her conviction settled over her like a burial shroud. I sat in the gallery and watched my daughter-in-law's life end in that federal courtroom. She would appeal, of course, but the evidence against her was so overwhelming that any appeal would be futile. Lauren Price, the beautiful and successful financial executive who'd humiliated me at Thanksgiving dinner, was now a convicted felon facing decades in federal prison. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, Lauren looked back at the gallery one final time. Her eyes found mine, and I saw a mixture of hatred and resignation in her expression. She finally understood what I'd understood that Thanksgiving night, that humiliating someone gives them nothing left to lose, and people with nothing left to lose can be extraordinary. She finally understood what I'd understood that Thanksgiving night, that humiliating someone gives them nothing left to lose, and people with nothing left to lose can be extraordinarily dangerous. I'd used her own arrogance against her, allowed her to confess her crimes voluntarily, and provided law enforcement with everything they needed to convict her completely. Some daughters-in-law learn to respect their husband's family. Others learn about federal sentencing guidelines. Lauren had chosen the harder lesson. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold February morning, exactly 4 months after Lauren's conviction on all 38 federal charges. I arrived at the courthouse early, wanting to secure a seat in the front row where Lauren would be forced to see me as she learned her fate. The courtroom was packed with victims, reporters, and curious citizens who'd been following the case since Lauren's arrest. The media had turned her prosecution into a symbol of white-collar crime and entitled privilege, and everyone wanted to witness the conclusion of her legal destruction. Lauren was led into the courtroom wearing the same orange jumpsuit she'd worn since her conviction. 4 months in federal custody had completed her transformation from beautiful executive to broken criminal. Her blonde hair hung limp and lifeless, her face was pale and drawn, and she moved with the shuffling gait of someone who'd lost all hope. Judge Patricia Morrison had presided over the trial with stern professionalism, and she brought that same gravity to the sentencing hearing. At 62, she was known for imposing harsh sentences on defendants who'd betrayed positions of trust. Ms. Price, Judge Morrison began, you have been convicted of 38 federal crimes involving the systematic theft of over $1.2 million from clients who trusted you with their life savings. Before I impose sentence, I want to hear from some of the people whose lives you've destroyed. The victim impact statements lasted for over an hour. One after another, Lauren's former clients stood up to describe how her theft had devastated their lives and their families. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, the 80-year-old widow whose testimony had been so powerful during the trial, spoke with quiet dignity about the destruction Lauren's crimes had caused. Your Honor, I worked for 40 years as a school teacher to save the money Lauren Price stole from me. That $200,000 was meant to pay for my grandchildren's education, to give them opportunities one never had. Now those children will struggle to afford college because she wanted designer handbags and luxury vacations. Other victims described similar devastation. A retired mechanic whose pension fund had been emptied. A young mother whose children's college savings had been stolen. A disabled veteran whose disability settlement had been looted to fund Lauren's shopping addiction. Each statement hammered home the human cost of Lauren's greed, the lives she destroyed to maintain her facade of success and wealth. When the victim statements concluded, Judge Morrison asked Lauren if she wanted to speak before sentencing. Lauren stood shakily, her voice barely audible. "Your Honor, I want to apologize to everyone I've hurt. I never meant for things to go this far. I made terrible mistakes, and I know I can never undo the damage I've caused." Even now, facing federal prison, Lauren couldn't fully acknowledge what she'd done. Mistakes and never meant for things to go this far weren't admissions of guilt. They were attempts to minimize systematic theft as accidental wrongdoing. Judge Morrison's expression didn't change. "Ms. Price, you didn't make mistakes. You made choices. For 3 years, you chose to steal from clients who trusted you. You chose to lie to cover up your crimes. You chose to live an extravagant lifestyle funded by other people's life savings." The judge consulted her notes. The federal sentencing guidelines recommend 15 to 20 years in prison for crimes of this scope and duration. The prosecution has asked for the maximum sentence. The defense has asked for leniency based on your age and lack of prior criminal history. Lauren was visibly shaking now, understanding that her life was about to be measured in decades of federal incarceration. "Ms. Price, you held a position of trust and used it to systematically destroy the financial security of vulnerable people. You showed no remorse until you were caught, and even now you characterize deliberate theft as mistakes. Your crimes were calculated, extensive, and devastating to your victims." Judge Morrison looked directly at Lauren. "I sentence you to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution of $1,247,000 to your victims, plus interest and penalties. All assets acquired through criminal activity are subject to immediate forfeiture." 18 years. Lauren would be 50 when she was released, her beauty gone, her career destroyed, her life permanently marked by federal conviction. Lauren collapsed in her chair, sobbing with the kind of desperate grief that comes from finally understanding the true cost of your choices. Her public defenders tried to comfort her, but there was nothing they could say that would change the reality of federal prison. As the bailiff prepared to escort Lauren back to custody, she looked across the courtroom one final time. Her eyes found mine, and I saw something I'd been waiting months to see. Complete understanding. She knew that I had destroyed her. She knew that the quiet elderly widow she'd humiliated had orchestrated every aspect of her downfall. She knew that her 18 years in federal prison were the direct result of choosing to throw plates on my floor and call me useless. I didn't smile or acknowledge her in any way. I simply watched as the woman who'd publicly humiliated me was led away to begin nearly 2 decades of federal incarceration. After the sentencing, reporters approached me for comment on Lauren's punishment. "Mrs. Cross, your daughter-in-law received one of the harshest sentences we've seen for financial fraud in this district. Do you think 18 years is appropriate?" "I think the sentence reflects the seriousness of Lauren's crimes and the devastating impact they had on her victims," I replied. "She stole over $1 million from people who trusted her, and she showed no remorse until she was caught. Justice has been served. What's next for your family?" "My son Michael and I will focus on rebuilding our lives and supporting Lauren's victims however we can. This has been a difficult time for everyone affected by her crimes." That evening, Michael called me from his temporary apartment. The house he'd shared with Lauren had been seized and sold to pay restitution to her victims, and his own assets had been frozen during the investigation. Mother, 18 years. I can't believe she got 18 years. The sentence was within federal guidelines for the crimes she committed, Michael. Lauren stole over $1 million from vulnerable people. Did you expect her to receive probation? I just thought, with the plea negotiations and her cooperation, Lauren didn't cooperate meaningfully with authorities, and she never accepted full responsibility for her crimes. Even today, she characterized systematic theft as mistakes rather than acknowledging the deliberate nature of what she did. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Mother, I need to ask you something directly. Did you have anything to do with Lauren's investigation and arrest? I considered my answer carefully. Michael deserved the truth, but I also needed to protect myself from any potential legal complications. Michael, I provided law enforcement with publicly available information when they asked for it. Lauren's crimes were discovered through professional auditing and forensic accounting, not through anything I did. But the timing was determined by Lauren's own behavior. She got careless, greedy, and arrogant. She was bound to be caught eventually. She thinks you orchestrated everything to get revenge for what happened at Thanksgiving. Michael, do you really think your elderly mother is capable of conducting a sophisticated financial investigation that resulted in federal charges? Lauren is looking for someone to blame other than herself. I'm simply a convenient target. After I hung up, I sat in Charles's study with a glass of wine, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment of complete victory. Lauren Price had humiliated me in front of 23 guests, throwing plates on my floor and calling me a useless old woman. Tonight, she was beginning an 18-year federal prison sentence that would destroy her life as thoroughly as she'd tried to destroy my dignity. The old woman she dismissed as powerless had proven to be the architect of her complete downfall. Every element of Lauren's destruction had been legal, methodical, and proportional to the cruelty she'd shown me. Some stories end with forgiveness and reconciliation. This one ended with justice and consequences. Lauren had learned that humiliating vulnerable people can be the most expensive mistake of your life, especially when the person you humiliate knows how to fight back. 2 years have passed since Lauren's sentencing, and my life has never been more peaceful. The house feels lighter without the constant tension of her presence, without the undercurrent of manipulation and hidden cruelty that had poisoned every family gathering. I've returned to my normal routines: gardening, reading, attending book club meetings, and charity events. But there's a fundamental difference in how people treat me now. The story of Lauren's prosecution has become local legend, and everyone knows that the quiet elderly widow had somehow been instrumental in exposing a $1 million embezzlement scheme. I neither confirm nor deny their suspicions. Let them wonder. Let them remember that underestimating someone based on age can be a fatal mistake. Michael has slowly rebuilt his life, though he's never fully recovered from the shame of being married to a convicted felon. His law firm kept him on after their investigation cleared him of any involvement in Lauren's crimes, but his partnership prospects were destroyed by the scandal. He's learned to live more modestly, without the stolen luxury that Lauren's crimes had provided. He calls me every few weeks, usually on Sundays, and we have pleasant conversations about safe topics: my garden, his work, the weather. We never discuss Lauren directly, but her absence hangs over every interaction like a ghost that neither of us wants to acknowledge. Mother, he said during his last call, I've been thinking about Thanksgiving 2 years ago. About what Lauren did to you that night. What about it, Michael? I should have stopped her. I should have defended you instead of sitting there like a coward. Yes, you should have. I was afraid of her anger, afraid of the fight that would follow if I contradicted her in front of her parents. And now I understand that some fights are worth having, that some people need to be confronted regardless of the consequences. It was the closest Michael had ever come to acknowledging that Lauren had deserved her fate, that my response to her cruelty had been justified. I receive updates on Lauren's incarceration through the Federal Victim Notification System. She's housed in a medium security facility 3 states away, working in the prison laundry, and attending mandatory financial responsibility classes. Her earliest possible release date is still 14 years away. The beautiful, arrogant woman who threw plates on my floor and called me useless is now inmate number 47291, wearing a prison uniform and following orders from guards who don't care about her former status or sophistication. More importantly, she's had 2 years to think about the choice she made that Thanksgiving night, to consider whether her momentary cruelty was worth the permanent destruction that followed. The money Lauren stole has been partially recovered through asset forfeiture and restitution payments, but most of her victims will never be fully compensated. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, the elderly widow whose grandchildren's college fund was stolen, received only 30 cents on the dollar from the asset recovery process. That's the real legacy of Lauren's crimes. Not just the prison sentence she's serving, but the permanent damage she caused to people who trusted her with their life savings. I've been contacted by several true crime writers who want to tell the story of Lauren's prosecution. They're fascinated by the case, by the dramatic fall from grace, and the family dynamics that preceded her arrest. I decline all interviews, maintaining the dignity and discretion that have always been my hallmarks. Let others speculate about my role in Lauren's downfall. I know the truth, and that's sufficient. My garden has flourished without the stress and tension that Lauren's presence brought to my life. The roses bloom more abundantly, the vegetables produce better harvests, and I've added new flower beds that fill the yard with color and fragrance. Sometimes, when I'm working in the soil, I think about the evening Lauren came to my house seeking sympathy and support, only to confess her crimes in detail while I served tea and played the role of the concerned mother-in-law. She'd been so desperate for an ally that she'd trusted the woman she'd humiliated with the evidence of her federal crimes. She'd assumed that family obligation would override justice, that maternal affection would protect her from the consequences of systematic theft. She'd been wrong on every count. I've made some changes to my will since Lauren's conviction, ensuring that the bulk of my estate will support causes that matter to me. Literacy programs, domestic violence shelters, and financial fraud victim assistance funds. Michael will inherit enough to be comfortable, but the days of assuming family wealth are over. The woman who tried to position herself as my eventual heir is spending the next 16 years in federal prison, and I want to ensure that no one else ever has the opportunity to exploit my family connections for personal gain. Last month, I received a letter forwarded through Lauren's prison counselor. The envelope was addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. Prison had changed even Lauren's penmanship, making it shaky and uncertain. I threw the letter away unopened, just as I've done with the 7 others she sent over the past 2 years. Whatever Lauren wants to say, apologies, explanations, requests for forgiveness, no longer interests me. She had 35 years to learn how to treat people with respect and kindness. She chose cruelty instead, and now she's living with the consequences of that choice. Some stories end with redemption and second chances. This one ends with an elderly woman sitting in her garden on a summer evening, reading a book about Roman history and feeling perfectly content with her solitude. The roses I planted after Lauren's conviction are blooming magnificently, their colors bright against the darkening sky. The vegetables I've been tending are ready for harvest, and tomorrow I'll pick enough tomatoes and peppers to share with my neighbors. It's a quiet life, peaceful and dignified, exactly what I'd hoped retirement would be before Lauren's presence poisoned every family gathering with her ambition and cruelty. The phone rings occasionally with calls from well-meaning friends who think I should move past Lauren's betrayal, who suggest that holding grudges is unhealthy for someone my age. I thank them for their concern and change the subject. They don't understand that this isn't about holding grudges, it's about maintaining standards. Lauren had every opportunity to be a good daughter-in-law, a trustworthy financial advisor, a decent human being. She chose theft, cruelty, and arrogance instead. Now she's serving an 18-year federal sentence that will define the rest of her life. I chose justice over sentiment, consequences over enablement, dignity over false forgiveness. I made the right choice. The garden needs watering, the book needs finishing, and tomorrow I'm having lunch with Judge Franklin Moore to discuss the scholarship fund we're establishing for students studying forensic accounting. It's a good life, made better by the absence of people who mistake kindness for weakness and age for vulnerability. Lauren wanted to reduce me to a useless old woman who cleaned up her messes and accepted her insults. Instead, she discovered that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone underestimates. I am 66 years old, beautiful, dignified, and absolutely ruthless when circumstances require it. And if anyone else thinks my age makes me powerless, they can ask Lauren Price what happened to the last person who made that mistake. She'll have plenty of time to tell them, about 14 more years, by my calculation. Vivian's story proves something powerful. Respect isn't given based on age. It's demanded through strength. If her journey of calculated justice inspires you, I want you to know about a resource that can help you reclaim your own power. Our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, offers proven strategies for rebuilding after betrayal and setting boundaries that protect your dignity. When people think you're too old to fight back, show them how wrong they can be. Click the link in the description to start your own journey of empowerment. Like this video if Vivian's ice-cold revenge satisfies your sense of justice. Subscribe for more stories of people who turned humiliation into victory, and hit that notification bell because everyone deserves to know that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone underestimates. Age brings wisdom, patience, and the resources to destroy those who mistake kindness for weakness.